term of 3 to 9 years, and he escaped prison.
And this was for auto theft, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he escaped the honor. What was that? The honor penitentiary.
It's a minimum security kind of place for people who were presumably not dangerous, etc. And he had just, in fact, been transferred there. Right. So that didn't go well, apparently. Just a month after he was transferred there, he said, okay, there's not many guards around, not much security. Wasn't much of an escape in the sense that all he had to do was walk off.
Right.
And that's what he did. And then what happened?
So he said that the reason why, he was on the run for 2 days and he was caught at a hotel.
And during the time he was on the run, so to speak, did he do anything by way of seeking help from authorities or reporting anything?
No.
Or did he just sort of
He just walked off.
just walked off and got to a hotel room and eventually was caught there? So why does he say he did this somewhat puzzling behavior, walking off in this way?
I wouldn't say it's puzzling at all.
Well, let me put it, if you didn't know what his claim was,
Right.
it would seem awfully puzzling because you're in worse shape. I mean, if you're in a minimum security honor farm, as they call it, then the odds are you're on your way out and going to be free in a fairly short order, right? So by escaping, he ends up getting himself in a position where he ends up in jail for a lot longer.
Right.
Right? So in that sense, unless you knew why would you do this, you knucklehead, it seems puzzling. So let's unzip the riddle. What makes it not so puzzling?
Well, he's 22. He's 5'7". He's 155 pounds. He's not a good fighter, and he says that he was threatened while he was at the honor farm with sexual assault, and when he tried to report that sexual assault, he was then threatened with physical abuse and death. And
You said he tried to report it? Wasn't that his explanation for why he didn't report it?
Defendant he testifies later that he received a call on the day he escaped. So he didn't report it before he escaped.
Or after he escaped?
Yeah, after
Which is
he was
a problem.
Yeah.
But he says he was, after the transfer, he had been sexually assaulted and sexually molested by 3 inmates. He names them at trial. He didn't. Apparently he was no longer as afraid for whatever reasons. He received death threats. He said he did this to save his life, and he was going to return once he found someone who could help him. If you were the prosecutor, Baker, what would you say to that?
Well, I would say that he's making up a story after the fact.
That's very nice of you to say that. Do you have any basis for that? Do you have any basis to undermine the credibility of his claim?
Well, that he's not seeking help from authorities or prison guards.
He had 2 whole days. It's not like he was still under this threat. He had time, if that was a true story, to tell someone, go to a police station, make a phone call to a relative, do something, because once he says, I plan to return if I find someone who can help me, why didn't you do that? Right? That would be the first thing I would say as a prosecutor, is like, the story doesn't hold up based on your own actions. Really, you left just because you didn't want to be incarcerated anymore, even in this minimum security environment. Right? Okay. So what happens at the first trial?
So at the first trial, he gets a jury instruction that over his objection, and that jury instruction is that the reasons for the escape are immaterial.
That's at the second trial.
Oh.
The first trial, what happened?
It was like a hung jury.
It was a hung jury. So the trial judge was going to have none of this. So Mr. Baker, what does the trial judge, to make sure we get a verdict, tell the jury in the second trial, as you started to tell us?
Oh, so he gives the instruction, people's instruction number 9. So the reasons, if any, given for the alleged escape are immaterial and not to be considered by you as in any way justifying or excusing if there were in fact such reasons.
And that is a classic example of a jury instruction that sort of cuts the jury's consideration of an issue off. Right? If the jury was inclined to believe the defendant's explanation for his actions, the trial judge is saying, you're not to consider that. That is not legally relevant. There may be facts that are presented to you, and maybe you find the defendant credible, maybe not, but maybe you do. Doesn't matter. The reasons he's given are immaterial and cannot justify or excuse what he did. And of course, the jury's going to convict based on that instruction because they just basically made his whole case irrelevant to the outcome. If you escaped, if you left, as they've charged you with doing, you're guilty. Okay? So naturally we have a conviction. What does the Intermediate Court of Appeals do?
So the Intermediate Court of Appeals, I guess, he raises the excuse that the jury instruction was a reversible error.
Okay, and now we go up to the Illinois Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
So the Intermediate Appellate Court says we have to have a new trial. There was a jury instruction that was materially wrong on the law, and now the prosecution takes this back up to the Illinois Supreme Court. What did they do?
And so the Illinois Supreme Court, they need to find out which affirmative defense he can have, either compulsion or.
What's their outcome? What do they do? What's the result?
There's a new trial, right?
Richter?
They say that the defense of necessity is the one that should be.
Just what's the result? Not the reasoning, what's the result?
They
They affirm the reversal. When I ask you what the result is, I just want outcome, right? Right? Reasoning, we'll get to. Okay? They affirm. They affirm, so there's going to be a new trial. Now, Mr. Baker, on what basis what had Unger asked for the jury to be told and the trial judge rejected?
That he had an affirmative defense of compulsion and necessity.
Right, okay. And what on necessity had he asked for a defense on? What instruction did he ask for that the trial judge refused to give?
That it was he reasonably believed.
Before that,
Oh.
there's two parts that he says the jury should have been told to a necessity defense.
That the defendant left the honor farm for reason of necessity without blame.
Without blame. Okay, that's the first prong of a necessity defense. You have to be without blame in the situation that gave rise to the necessity. Okay, so he says the jury should have been told that if they found I was without blame, right? If Unger was without blame in the situation, and how would you argue? Let's say the judge had given that instruction, Mr. Baker. How would you argue to the jury as defense lawyer that he fulfills that prong under these facts?
Well, that it was really a choice between two evils.
No. Listen to what I'm asking. How would you argue that he was without blame? That prong. I'm not getting to the second prong yet. What about the first prong?
That it wasn't really his free will to.
No, that's compulsion.
Okay.
Webb?
That he wasn't, like, the victim of sexual assault isn't to blame for the sexual assault.
Yeah, right. Here you're arguing the facts. You're saying once the jury has this law told to it, you'll say, and we fulfilled this prong because the victim of sexual assault or a threat of sexual assault is not to blame for being put in that position. So ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we ask you to find that he was certainly blameless in the situation that produced this necessity, right? And if that could be a problem for you as the defense, if, for example, the prosecution had evidence that the assault he faced was the result of something he provoked, right? That he had been somehow threatening other inmates, and he got, this was retaliation for something, then he would be with blame, right? So you would argue, no, he was just completely an innocent victim of this chain of events. Okay? Now, what about the second prong, Mr. Baker? He was without blame, and
His conduct's necessary to avoid.
it had to be necessary?
He reasonably believed
There
that
you
his
go.
conduct was necessary to avoid public or private injury greater than the injury which might reasonably result from his own conduct.
Okay, so you got two prongs. Blameless and reasonably believed. Doesn't have to be true. The necessity doesn't have to be actually true, but he reasonably believed that it was necessary to avoid an injury greater than the injury that he caused, or that would reasonably result. So that's a sort of a balancing test, right? We'll put aside the reasonably believed part, but what he must reasonably believe is that the injury avoided. What was the injury avoided, Mr. Baker?
The sexual assault.
Good. I.e. sexual assault was greater than the injury that could reasonably, got some reasonableness in this, all over this definition, be expected to result from Unger's. And what was that conduct?
I guess longer incarceration for being caught.
No, what was his conduct?
Oh,
Escape. You balance the harm, presumably a crime, that was being avoided by the action he's being prosecuted for, and you balance it against the harm that is involved in the conduct he engaged in. Right? So if he reasonably believed that this injury or harm that was being avoided is bigger than this injury, then then he has a defense. Okay? I'm going to put that up here now. So what crime can necessity never be a defense for?
Intentional killing?
Intentional murder. Because if you engage in intentional murder, nothing that you are said to avoid is worse. So the law says if this is the thing you did and you try to raise necessity, go away. No defense for intentional murder. And that is built into the KRS 503.030. Has this exact provision divided into two subsections, one of which has the belief, and the second of which makes it, if your belief was wanton or reckless, then you get only mitigation. So that's how you get the reasonable part. And it specifically says it is not available for intentional murder. 503.030. Okay? What problem, Mr. Baker, does Unger have in one word?
Believability?
No, I don't know. It's pretty, at least he might be believable. That's a jury issue. What problem does he have in terms of even being able to get this issue to the jury? What do I want when I ask you for one word almost every time?
Evidence?
No. His testimony might be believed. That'll get him to the jury at least. If the jury would find him credible, in terms of even getting to the jury, he's got a problem. One word, I want a case. case gives him a huge problem?
Lover,
Lover camp. Why is lover camp a problem?
because all 5 of the elements need to be met.
And Lover Camp had said, in interpreting this basic idea, there are certain requirements that the defendant must meet. This is an Illinois Supreme Court decision. And what are some of the elements that he really doesn't seem to meet as a matter of law, even if you believe every word of his story?
He didn't immediately report to the proper authorities.
Okay, immediately report. Anything else?
Are you asking for the 5?
I'm asking for which of the 5 it sure looks like Unger doesn't meet. Mr. Wiseman?
The second one where it says there's no time for a complaint to the authorities.
No time for a complaint. Sure looks like in this case, he could have gone to prison authorities. There was certainly time for a complaint. Anything else? Some of those 5 factors that certainly seem to make it look like his circumstances don't fit the Lover Camp factors.
No time or opportunity to resort to the courts, and a history of futile complaints.
A history of futile complaints. We just talked earlier. He hadn't made any complaints. Now he says this was because he was feeling threatened, but there was no history of futile complaints. So if you're applying Lover Camp, if I'm the prosecution, I think I've got this in my hip pocket. Because Lover Camp said these have to be present, or you can't have necessity. Right? If you're going to avail yourself of this, you better at least try other things first. Because if you can try other things first, what do those other things represent? They represent alternatives. And if there are alternatives to the thing you did, in this case escaping, what can we say is true?
It wasn't necessary.
It wasn't necessary. And the very defense we're talking about here is necessity. So he's a dead duck. Unger loses. Or does he? What happens?
The court said that the existence of the conditions were not, as a matter of law, necessary to establish a necessity defense.
What is the significance of the Lover Camp factors?
They're factors to be weighed, but they don't necessarily keep him from raising the defense.
They're not absolute requirements. Factors to be weighed. By the jury. So if you're the prosecutor, you don't get to cite these factors and say, if one or more of them fails to be present, you don't get to say, therefore he loses the defense and the jury should be instructed the way the trial judge instructed them, saying, you don't consider necessity if it doesn't meet one of the Lover Camp factors. Instead, the prosecution has to argue this and say, ladies and gentlemen, the jury reject his defense. You can consider it, as the trial judge said you couldn't, you can consider it, but the fact that he didn't immediately report should cast grave doubt on his claim of necessity, because he claims that he had to get out of there immediately, but anyone who felt that need, who was pressed by that fear, would have immediately reported once they were in a relative place of safety. What happened here? 2 days passed at least. So you'd have to argue it. You don't get an absolute bar to the defense. Okay? Questions about Unger? I want to just briefly note that the court says we're going to put aside compulsion, and because he also raised this compulsion defense, and view it only under the necessity umbrella, and in a weird way, I think that the court says compulsion isn't a factor, because it says he still had free will to choose. But I don't think that's what compulsion's about. That makes sort of this idea that, hey, you could choose, and you could choose to be subjected to sexual assault. I don't really see that. I think if there's a necessity defense on the facts, then there's a compulsion defense on the facts. But the court just puts that aside in reasons I can't really explain to you, other than the court said, look, we're going to reverse on necessity, and we'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. How many people think, from what you know, both on what the prosecution can argue from these and what Unger testified to, how many people think he should have a decent, a winning, successful necessity defense? Few hands. How many people think he shouldn't have a necessity defense? More hands. Okay. I have no idea what happened on remand, so I can't tell you the rest of the story. But I think you can see it both ways. I think you can see some of the weaknesses in the defense case that the Lovercamp factors point to, but I think you can see, boy, it's a compelling story if he comes off as credible in convincing the jury the quote-unquote choice he faced. And it also helps him that he didn't do anything criminal after the escape. Yes, he didn't report, he didn't try to get help, but he didn't, go rob a store either, right? You could at least argue that his only purpose was to get safe, to get to safety. So it's an interesting case where you can see the arguments on both sides. Okay? All right. Let's talk about Crawford, which is one of the most bizarre cases. We almost closed the semester with one of the more bizarre cases of the semester. Crime spree across the Midwest or the Plains. So what happened on February 17th, 1991? Mr. Razor.
Crawford is transported from Kansas City to Topeka with his drug dealer and the drug dealer's girlfriend.
That's Bateman, sort of
Yes.
the villain of the story in a way. And what's the impetus for Bateman and Crawford's conduct in the events we're about to talk about?
Crawford is indebted to Bateman at the sum of $10,000 for the cocaine.
That he'd owed him for cocaine. And to pay off this debt, what did Bateman want out of Crawford?
A string of burglaries.
He said, let's commit some robberies, right? That's what, we're in Topeka, and that's sort of the thing to do in Topeka, apparently, at least according to Bateman. So give me a sense of how this unfolds. What happens at, for example, Parkview Hospital?
A woman is walking out of the hospital and Bateman comes up to her with a gun. She grabs the barrel of the gun and the two struggle.
She is no shrinking violet, Miss Overholt.
No.
Right? She's like, you point a gun at her, she's gonna fight for the gun. I don't know Nancy Jo Overholt. I don't know if she's even still alive, but if I ever was in a dark alley and being threatened, I'd want her by my side. She's tough. Now, it didn't work. Right? She wrestles for the gun, but Crawford's able to pull it from her grasp and he hits her with it. So it didn't work out for her in this moment. And what then happens with her?
She gives him her wedding rings, but she can't get another ring on, so he hits her again. At which point he walks away from her. She stands back up and yells to a nearby man that this guy has a gun and that he should run.
And that's Mulholland,
Yes.
who's our next victim of this crime spree. And Crawford threatens him, and he forces him to drive off at gunpoint, right?
Yes.
And what happens between them?
So he makes him drive to Mulholland's. Well, first he gets Mulholland's wallet and checkbook. He sees the address and tells him to drive to his duplex. Once there, he starts kind of going through all his contents and trying to get all the valuables. Once he's completed getting all of those valuables, he goes to the other apartment in the duplex.
Miss Luca.
Yes, and gets
Sounds
some
like a character in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory somehow. Luca. And so he takes jewelry from her, right?
Yes.
So that he and Mulholland load things in the car. They set off to find an ATM because he's going to use Mulholland's ATM card. On the way, they go to Nancy Kinney's house. She's robbed at gunpoint. Then they went to the ATM and got money. And then they went to the hotel. What does Crawford do with Mulholland?
Puts him in the trunk of the car.
puts him in the trunk, and drives to Lawrence, Kansas. And then they get to a hotel in Lawrence, the Holodome, and Bateman, how does Bateman feel about all this?
He is not satisfied with the evening's take and threatens to harm him and his son if he does not get more.
And he said, wait till after midnight and then rob the hotel. Bateman's just a great guy, right? So what happens with Mulholland at this point?
He kicks out the back seat and drives the car to...
Because they left the keys in the car.
Yes. He
Stupid
drives-
criminal tricks for your enjoyment. And he gets the police, the thing Unger didn't do, gets the police, and they find Crawford hidden underneath a table at the restaurant in the hotel. So what's Crawford say about all this?
That he was being threatened, that him and his son were being threatened by Bateman, and so that he had a claim of necessity.
And he believed, he says, that Bateman was in fact going to kill him, right? He felt like he had to do what Bateman could do. Why did he think Bateman was such a threat?
Bateman was connected to a violent gang, the Moorish Americans.
Which I had never heard of. Almost sounds a little comical, but you know what it is? The word of the day. Our last word of the day of the semester is Clemens. Moorish, okay? And he says they were involved in drugs, gang violence, revenge killings. So my fear was legitimate and real, not just made up. This guy was the real deal, a real menace. So what does Kansas law say about compulsion?
That person is not guilty of the crime when he performs under the compulsion of a threat of imminent infliction of death or great bodily harm if he reasonably believes that death or great bodily harm will be inflicted upon him or upon his spouse, parent, child, brother, or sister if he does not perform such conduct.
And of course, this is for a crime other than murder or voluntary manslaughter. So we get our intentional murder, except it's expanded slightly to any intentional homicide, right? Because voluntary manslaughter is an intentional homicide under Kansas law. Okay? So if you commit a crime other than those, if you commit one of those crimes, don't come crying to us about compulsion. You should not have done those no matter what the threat to you was. And that's an interesting thing the law says. That someone, let's say in hypothetically, someone threatens your child. I'm going to kill your child unless you kill this other person for me. I think a lot of people might find that the kind of situation that even killing somebody, you could at least feel like it was an act that was compelled. But the law says no matter what the threat is, you are not under compulsion, regardless if the crime is murder or voluntary manslaughter. Okay? So if you're under that compulsion, what are you being threatened with? Death or serious bodily injury, great bodily harm, and you reasonably believe that this will be inflicted, then you can commit one of these other crimes and not be held culpable for it. Okay? Also, as you see on 632, the case tells you that the defense is not available if you have put yourself in the situation where it is probable you will be subjected to compulsion or threat. Again, an overlap with necessity. Right? Necessity, we said, you had to be without blame in the situation that gave rise to the necessity. Here, the parallel to that, closely related, if you were willful or wanton in getting into the situation that somebody else could threaten you. Okay. And the lights dim. What did the trial judge say that Crawford complains was erroneous based on that law and these facts?
That a threat of future injury is not enough, particularly after the danger from the threat has passed.
What must the compulsion be when you say that it can't be a future threat?
Imminent?
It must be imminent and impending, right? So the court says a threat of future injury is not enough, especially if the danger from the threat has passed. Okay? Why is Crawford's argument on this pretty weak? when he says the court was wrong to say that the compulsion must be imminent and impending, and that a future threat is not going to really get it done. What sort of simple fact makes that argument pretty weak?
That Bateman wasn't there, or?
Not on the facts, on the law. Yes, on the facts, he's also got a problem, but on the law. He's saying, look, the court got the law wrong by requiring imminence, by saying future harm isn't enough, and then what they told the jury. Ms. Harper?
He says that the legislators' use of the word imminent was not designed to threat a future infliction of death.
The legislature's use of the word, right? It's in the statute, right? And when it's in the statute, it's awfully hard to say that the court got the law wrong in telling the jury that's the law, right? One place you want to always start, or at least look, is what does the statute say? Because when a defendant says the jury instruction misstated the law, that's the argument you're making to the appellate court. And if the statute that's being applied, sometimes it'll be vague, sometimes it won't have that word, and the courts are interpreting the statute, and then they have to decide what's the best interpretation. The statute says exactly what the instruction says. That is going to be a weak argument, and the prosecution, if the jury instruction being challenged is being challenged by the defense, the prosecution's going to have a pretty good argument that the statute says exactly what the instruction says. That is your go-to argument if you're the prosecutor. Hey, appellate court, the trial judge didn't get this wrong. It exactly tracked the statute. Okay? And that is a key problem for Crawford. Okay? So what does the court say, Mr. Razor?
That the evidence in this case is different from those other cases, so it should be taken into account.
Is that what the court says?
That the jury instructions were correct and that Crawford did not present facts that met those instructions.
The court is not impressed with the argument that Crawford makes, that the case is like a series of others where the courts found required compulsion not present. The court says it is like those cases because the required element of an imminent threat is missing, the compulsion is not continuous, and there were opportunities to escape, right? And Crawford wants the jury to be able to consider the reasons of his belief that he faced compulsion under all the circumstances, but the court says no, imminence is a requirement. There's nothing in the factors that Crawford points to that make the court that believes this case is different from those others. And so, no. Here, we get imminence really pressed hard. And what would you do? Let's say you believed that that a situation like the one Crawford faced with Bateman should be enough to at least let the jury to consider whether or not this was compelling. What would you need to do?
He says something about his son being under threat as well, right?
Yeah,
Well, it wasn't.
but that's not imminent. Next. What would you have to do, Ms. Call?
Are we the defense, or the?
I'm not saying who you are.
Well, if I would,
We have this decision, it's on the books.
I would argue that he put himself in this situation anyway.
Well, let's say you don't believe that. Let's say you believe that the law should be that you should at least have a defense here. Maybe the jury would reject it. What has to happen? What has to happen? Let's say you wanted this not to be the law.
Legislature needs to change.
Go to the legislature, right? The courts have said The legislature has imminent in the statute, and if we think that's bad, if we think that's not the way the criminal law should be, that it should be more, we should be more open to a broader range of situations where a person might feel compelled, even though the threat is down the road, because the threat may be unavoidable, because the person is part of a broader network of people who can carry out the threat at some point. Let's say, you say, oh, well, it has to be in there because you have to have no alternative. So you report Bateman. Bateman gets caught, but the threat's still there because there's this whole gang that can carry it out. So let's say we believe that. Now, you may or you may not. But if you believe that the court should look more broadly at a set of facts, then the legislature has to step in and come up with language that eliminates the imminence requirement and maybe has a series of factors for courts to consider. But that's the relationship between courts as they interpret a statute, and then legislatures reacting to that interpretation if they think it makes bad public policy. Okay? But here, when imminence is in the statute, it's awfully hard to say that Crawford has a reasonable defense on these facts.
So is there kind of like in the KRS, under the murder statute, it has like a subsection that says like this also includes like when someone's driving a car and they kill someone or something? Is that kind of the same thing? Like you would ask the legislator to add that, or do you ask the legislator?
That's exactly what happened. There was the Kentucky Supreme Court was expressing a lot of skepticism about vehicular homicides and the idea that they could rise to murder, and the legislature wanted to make it very clear that they could be a form of wanton murder, and so they clarified in the statute if the person acts wantonly and with extreme indifference to human life, then it can be murder, right? So legislatures react to judicial decisions, either telling the court they got it wrong or clarifying when there's doubt. Right? Now they can't do that if it's a constitutional decision. Legislatures can't amend constitutions. They can start a process of constitutional amendments, right, at the state or federal level, but they can't, just by passing a statute, override a constitutional decision. But here, we're just talking about what the criminal statutes require, how they dictate policy, and so the legislature can say, you know what, we think you got that wrong. But I'm not saying they did, I'm just using this as an example. That's the step you have to take, if you think they got it wrong. Okay? Questions? Yeah?
So if they did, say a year later or 2 years later, they did expand the definition of imminence under the statute, would Crawford be able to come back with a defense, assuming he'd been convicted for that, or is he's done?
No, the legislature, there's a whole body of law about retroactive applications of statutes. And he committed this behavior under the law as it existed at that time. Now, the legislature could make that different if it wanted to, but they never do. Or somebody like Crawford could then go to the governor and say, the law has changed, the state has decided that this was not a just result, the criminal justice system should have a different approach to this, use some sort of pardon or clemency. So that is a possible way of proceeding, but not, if the law was X when you were convicted, the fact that it's amended, they almost universally amend it only for cases that arise going forward. Okay? And that brings us to Hunter, our last case of the semester. So Hunter did, this is no alcohol involved here. Alcohol seems to have been one of the themes of the semester, but it did involve something that is arguably equally dangerous in creating situations of potential harm. What had Hunter been doing?
Hitchhiking.
He was hitchhiking, and he got into the truck with Ramada, and things immediately go downhill. What happens?
Ramada displayed guns, and he made some remarks about killing hitchhikers.
And of all the things you would want to hear if you're Hunter, that's probably right at the top of the list. Because you are a...
Hitchhiker.
Yeah, so that's not good.
It's dead last.
And then he refuses to let Hunter out of the truck. So at this point, if you're Hunter, you're, wishing you said your goodbyes, wishing you'd made your will. It's not looking good. So as they're driving along, Ramada decides, you know what? It's time to have some fun.
Oh
Let's party. How does Ramada party?
Well, a police officer pulls him over, and so he shoots the officer.
Fortunately, not fatally.
Officer does not die, is what it says. Yeah, and so then they go to a grain elevator.
By the way, this is also a Kansas case. Weird things are happening in Kansas, right? From the last two cases. He goes to a grain elevator, and Ramada shoots another person. Ramada's on a roll. And then what happens?
And so then he takes a couple of hostages.
He?
With the assistance of Hunter.
And that's the key.
Yes.
So Hunter has now participated in the felony of
Kidnapping.
Right? And that's key. Right? He has now committed a crime himself as an accomplice to, and totally culpable for the crime of another at this point. He's participated in the felony of kidnapping. That's Schroeder and Moore. What happens to Schroeder and Moore?
Well, they get driven off some distance, and so then Ramada kills them.
He kills them.
Yes.
As a result of these events, what happens to Hunter?
Well, so he is convicted at trial of the felony murder.
Felony murder. Remember our whole discussion of felony murder, which does not exist per se in Kentucky, is if you participate, now it can happen several ways, right? But the way we have here is if you participate in the commission of a dangerous felony, and I think we can all agree kidnapping is one heck of a dangerous felony. Right? If you participate in a dangerous felony, and one of your accomplices kills during the commission of that felony, you are guilty not just of the felony here, kidnapping, but of the murder, even though you didn't intend to kill anybody. Even though you didn't intend to kill anybody. And this is either a form of strict liability, as some courts have argued, because you're being held liable without regard to your intent for the actions of another, or it's a case of transferred intent, which is more what I think it is, because you're using the intent to commit the kidnapping and transferring it over and holding the person liable for murder. Either way, it's a tough situation for the person who didn't kill anyone, may not have intended anyone to be killed, may not have wanted anyone to be killed, but because you participated here, you're culpable here. Okay, a little refresher on felony murder. What does Hunter argue?
Well, so he argues that he ought to have compulsion as a defense, and so the appeal is based on the fact that the trial court did not grant that as a defense.
And where are we going to start looking to see if the judge got this right? That is the trial judge?
Into the statute?
Of course. This is that on the board, so why not? Okay, so what does the statute say in the Kansas Code?
It is a defense to these charges if the defendant acted under compulsion.
Well, you said these charges. Let's unpack that.
Sorry, aggravated battery against a law enforcement officer, aggravated robbery, and aggravated kidnapping.
All of which Hunter had been charged with. He says, you should have told the jury I have, against any of these charges, now go ahead.
If he acted under the compulsion or threat of immediate infliction of death or great bodily harm, and if said defendant reasonably believed that death or great bodily harm would have been inflicted upon him if he hadn't acted as he did.
And why did the trial judge say no to that?
Because the murder is not mentioned in that part of the defense.
And so it's an issue the issue on the appeal is, does this transfer over, along with the intent transferring over, does the defense that you might have, the compulsion defense that you might have to those underlying felonies, does it count when felony murder is involved? What does the Kansas Supreme Court say?
The Kansas Supreme Court says that they do think that it should, apply to this situation because when they mention.
Well, let's start with this. What's the prosecution's argument, Mr. Williams?
The prosecution's argument is just that, with these kinds of defenses, you don't usually get that.
What do you mean you don't usually get that?
Because of the kind of weighing of the harms.
Okay,
that,
and what did we say is a blanket universal limitation on necessity and here compulsion?
The intentional killing.
Intentional killing, right? You do not get this defense as to intentional killing. And the prosecution says, this was an intentional killing. Yes, you're being sort of bootstrapped in to the intentional killing done by Renata, but it's an intentional murder nonetheless, and therefore it should not be applicable to this offense, right? So this rule, the prosecution argues against allowing this to be considered lesser. It has to be a lesser crime you commit because you're compelled by this threat. It isn't lesser, and this same rule should be applied here to felony murder. And that's certainly not an embarrassing argument. It's certainly not, it has some real heft to it, right? Because killing is so serious, taking life is so serious, that we don't want to ever sort of communicate the idea in our criminal law that something else you do is worse. That is the worst, okay? And so what does the Kansas Supreme Court say? Now, there's two states, Arizona and Missouri, that have held that defendants cannot claim compulsion in felony murder, right? So if you ever get a case like this and you're the prosecutor and you want to use, say you're in a jurisdiction that has felony murder, and you want to use to tell the court to reject compulsion, you're going to go to these Arizona and Missouri cases. You're going to cite those and say, that's what you should follow, court. And you're going to say, not so much to Kansas. So why does the Kansas Supreme Court reject the Arizona and Missouri approaches, which do equate intentional murder and felony murder for purposes of putting compulsion off limits?
They want to make a distinction between crimes of intentional killing and a killing done by another during the commission of a lesser felony.
And why is that? That's the outcome, but why? What reasoning does the court give? Take it in two steps. The court sort of gives you a since this, then this approach.
They compare it to the guy that gets compelled to drive someone at gunpoint to a robbery.
Okay.
And that they shouldn't be held culpable for a killing that goes on during the robbery.
Unless they committed the killing themselves.
Right.
But if somebody else does it. So the court says, excellent, Mr. Williams. The court says, since Hunter would have had this defense, it would have been a lesser felony than, because he feels like he's going to get killed, let's say. Kidnapping is a lesser felony than that. Since he would be justified in committing the lesser felony that is the predicate, that he shouldn't lose it because unexpectedly his accomplice does this. So the court takes a different view of the applicability of intentional murder because it focuses in on the intent of the actual defendant, that is Hunter in this case. And since Hunter didn't have the intent to
intentionally
kill anybody, he did kidnap, let's say we hold him culpable for that, but he didn't intentionally murder, so the logic gets cut off. The logic doesn't follow when we transfer it over to felony murder, right? And so since we should therefore ask about the predicate felony, the underlying felony, is that a lesser offense that you can commit under compulsion? Right? So this court says when it's felony murder as opposed to intentional murder, compulsion can be a defense because of where we're focusing our attention on what counts as a lesser felony. Of course, the instruction is still only justified. Okay, we got kidnapping, we got aggravated battery against the law enforcement officer, robbery, all that. There has to be sufficient evidence from which the jury could find compulsion. Right? It's all well and good to say it legally works, but what does the court say about whether there was sufficient evidence to create a jury issue?
They look at the evidence that was presented, and they mention 6 things specifically dealing with Ramada's behavior. The firing the .22 out of the car window, I'm assuming just randomly. That he talked about a hitchhiker that he wished he had killed. Took out a couple of .357 bullets and asked Hunter if he thought those would kill him.
But there were witnesses who testified that Hunter had a weapon. Doesn't that indicate an intent to do more than just kidnap?
Yeah, the state's witnesses testify that, but Ramada testified that he had control of them at all times. So that's one of those jury has to weigh kind of things.
Excellent, right? That's exactly the point. There can be sufficient evidence even if the evidence is in conflict, right? Yeah, there's some evidence from which you could infer, and the prosecutor will try to argue that, hey, he did have the intent, and that you can find that this was intentional and not just felony murder. But there's also conflicting evidence. That's what juries do. So if there's enough evidence from which the jury could find the compulsion, then the jury has to be given that opportunity once we've decided that the doctrine even applies. Doctrine applies, there's enough evidence here that it could apply specifically to Hunter, and therefore there has to be a jury issue. There has to be a verdict from the jury considered with proper instructions. Okay? Questions? Okay, that's it. We have finished our last case. I have never, honestly, never gotten through the entire syllabus, even minutes early, much less with a day to spare. So, I don't know what that means, but well done you.
You couldn't have done it.
And I will see you, if you choose to be here, I will see you tomorrow. Same time. Treat tomorrow.